Hello, we're back, and in this video lecture, we're going to talk about PCS procedures, for the respiratory system. Okay, these codes are found in Table 0 for medical surgical, B, respiratory system, and 1 through 0B, Y. The root operations that you see in Table 13.2 include such things as a bypass, change, destruction, dilation, drainage, excision, extirpation, and so on. The body part involved in the procedure is shown in Table 13.3. This gets involved. This is an area where you may want to have a medical dictionary handy and look at these exact terms. We can have the tracheobronchial tree. That's different than the trachea. The bronchus, right and left. The upper lobe bronchus, right and left. Notice the middle lobe bronchus only has the right, because right and left lungs are not exactly symmetrical, as you can probably recall from anatomy. And again, the body part involved is in 13.3. So let's take a quick look at that table. And again, as you're coding these procedures, look for some of these terms to make sure that you're on the right body part. The bronchus, the trachea, and so on. Each of these will have a different character that will go in the fourth character spot. And now we get to the approach. And table 13.4 is the approach. It could be open, it could be percutaneous endoscopic, via natural or artificial opening, via a natural or artificial opening endoscopic, or external. The key is to read the documentation very carefully. The sixth character describes if there is a device, and these could be drainage devices, radioactive elements, monitoring devices, tissue substitutes, stents, all different types of things. Let's take a look at table 13.5. So this is what's going to go in the sixth character. And again, a lot of these you'll be able to parse out by looking at what the root operation is and thinking about what the objective of the procedure is. Could be a drainage device, monitoring, and so on. And you can see these listed here. Of course, they're the same that you'll see in your PCS code book. And the seventh character, of course, is the qualifier. And these are different additional attributes about the procedure. And some examples of these include whether something is allogenic, syngenic, zooplastic, cutaneous, esophagus, or has no qualifier at all. Something that's becoming a lot more common is a closed endoscopic biopsy. With these closed endoscopic biopsies, there is a procedure where we use a scope with a camera, visual inspection of a cavity or an organ, right? And this is called, the device is called an endoscope. It's inserted into the cavity or the organ, has light on the end of it so they can see, and transmits the image to the lens of the viewer, and the physician operating it can see the area. And this can be inserted either via the nose or through the lower respiratory tract. A closed endoscopic biopsy is an excision of tissue for diagnostic purposes through a bronchoscope in the respiratory system. So the biopsy can be an excision. In other words, they're cutting out or off without replacement a portion of a body part. Right. And again, you have to, when you're coding these, you have to look at the body part being excised and the approach used, such as a bronchoscopy via a natural or artificial opening endoscopic. If you see that term bronchoscopy, you are going to have via natural or artificial opening endoscopic. So let's take a look at table 13.7 on how we can construct that code. And again, we have the first three characters as described in the slides and the text as 0BB. The body part is going to be everything that we covered earlier, right? You can see them all listed here, trachea, lower lobe, bronchus, so on. And then the approach, if it's a bronchoscopy, it's going to be via natural artificial opening endoscopic. That takes us all the way through 5 characters. And then if no device is used, it's Z, and then it's just a matter of the qualifier. It's either diagnostic or it has no qualifier. Then finally, we have vents. Mechanical ventilation is the process where we're using a device to pump air into a patient's lungs, even when the patient is not able to breathe on their own. It's a non-surgical procedure, and it's coded to extracorporeal assistance and performance. So these are codes that begin with 5A1. So you can see 5A1935Z, 5A1945Z, and 5A155Z. These are the mechanical vents. If we're inserting an endotracheal tube as part of a vent, this is coded as a separate procedure. And this would be 0BH17EZ or 0BH18Z. And the codes are based on the time, less than 24 consecutive hours, 24 to 96, and greater than 96. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Bye now.